Okay, good morning, everyone. Well, first of all, thank you very much for being here this morning. I know in Montreal, finding a parking spot and be able to beat the traffic is something in itself, so congratulations, you made it. Today, we're going to have two roundtables. The first roundtable, we are lucky we have two very good speakers who will be actually talking about issues that we're facing right now in anti-corruption and also anti-bribery. The way we're going to make it is we'll make it very interactive. They're going to start talking about something, and if you want to join in, please feel free. I did ask them, and they're very comfortable with that, so there'll be two people walking around with microphone. We'll actually go next to you because everything is recorded, so everything you say will be held against you in a court of law. No joking, but honestly, it is recorded, so speak loud and have as much fun as possible. They're both very comfortable with answering any kind of question that you have. So we'll start off just by introducing them to you. Usually what we do, the guy in front talk about the people, which I don't find to be fair for the people because we only read about whatever we decided to say about them. So what I will do, I'll make it more interactive. I will let them self-introduce. So the first person to my left will be Patrice Poitevin. Patrice.
Again, work in the sphere of anti-corruption and compliance and ethics to help Canadian companies and others, private and public organizations, mitigate and help themselves deal with corruption risk.
Great, thanks Pat. My name is W.Boscariol. I'm a lawyer at a firm called McCarthy, Tétrault. We have offices across Canada, in the UK, as well as a rep office in New York City. I practice in the area of anti-corruption, anti-bribery law, as well as economic sanctions, trade controls, export controls, defense controls as well. I'm very happy to see so many people out this morning. This is great. We want this to be really interactive. Pat and I have different views on some of these issues, so hopefully we'll get into some debate about some of the issues around enforcement and compliance. My practice is focused on a number of areas when it comes to anti-corruption. Includes compliance, internal investigations, dealing with enforcement authorities, as well as covering due diligence for some of our clients on the corporate side who might be engaging with either third parties or involved in transactions involving targets, and it's necessary to review those targets to determine their risk exposure to corruption and bribery.
Perfect. So that being said, we had a couple of predefined questions. I'll start off with one of them, and as I said, at any time you want to jump in and ask other questions, feel free. With the first one, John and Pat, could you speak to us about enforcement trend in Canada as well as globally, and how this is affecting Canadian company?
Well, maybe I can start.
You can start.
From a former enforcement officer. If you look at Canada, let's just start with Canada itself. CFPOA, the excuse me, Corruption Foreign Public Officials Act, is the law that basically looks at companies, Canadian citizens, Canadian residents that operate outside of Canada. But also the criminal code, we have, secret commission, so corruption domestically and in foreign jurisdictions. We have those laws in place, and they evolve all the time. But what has changed in the last 5 to 10 years is how enforcement action has become much more present, much more aggressive, much more coordinated. Where in the past we had the laws in place. Before 2007, the laws were in place, but the RCMP did not have specialized unit to enforce the CFPOA. From there, we had specialized units. So we have dedicated investigators specifically trained to investigate foreign bribery practices and wrongdoing. But what has evolved in a global sense is a better coordination of those investigative practices. So we have the International Foreign Bribery Task Force, which includes the FBI, the RCMP, the UK authorities and the Australian authorities, and also other authorities that bring their experience to bear. But what is helping in terms of investigation is the collaboration and coordination of those investigations. So let's say we have a Canadian company that operates in a foreign jurisdiction. And it may be easier because of the evidence, because of how the scheme is operating, for a partner to obtain evidence or to do the investigation. We will either support that investigation or work in parallel with them. Because on a daily basis, we're in contact with those foreign enforcement agencies to help the investigation move forward. You know, this is a global problem. The evidence is a lot of time outside of Canada. So we need to be able to collaborate to get that evidence. And what also has changed in terms of enforcement action is, in the past, if you look at especially the United States, a lot of focus was on the companies themselves. You know, you had a lot of deferred prosecution agreement, you had fines, but it was the companies that paid the fine, and the individuals, the players, the wrongdoers themselves were not really targeted for all intents and purposes. You had prosecution of individuals, but really was focused on the companies. What is happening now, not just in the United States, but in other jurisdictions, is focusing on the bad players, on those that are also paying the bribe, so that it has an impact on the C-suite, on the decision makers, on the directing minds, that it's not just the company that is going to be targeted, but the individuals that pay the bribe. And of course, what has to be put in context as these are highly complex investigations. If you look at the jurisdiction, it's one thing to investigate crime, this type of crime, in Canada, where we have processes. But when you deal with different jurisdictions, it's highly complex because we need to obtain the evidence in a separate jurisdiction. That sometimes we may not be able to trust the provenance, how this evidence was gathered. So it can take, in average, the OECD shows that a foreign corruption investigation can take from 5 to 7 years. So it takes a long time. Okay? But during that time, there's a lot of impact on the corporation. You know, they still have a dark cloud while the investigation is ongoing. So in terms of enforcement action, there's an evolution to all this. There's an evolution in Canada, there's an evolution in various jurisdictions, and the complexity of the investigation lends itself to ensure that we need to have the collaboration. It has to be a collective effort. And what also has changed is the type of fine and the repercussion on the offending parties, whether it's a company or individuals. If you look at the latest fines from the OECD, from the United States and others, they're fairly high because you want to have that deterrent effect. You want to be able to change the behavior. So it is still very much an evolutionary process in terms of enforcement. But I think that the more we are going, because of also the trends in terms of greater transparency, greater accountability, more laws that push that transparency and accountability, is that you have more exposure with a lot of companies that are operating either domestically or in foreign markets to the fact that something's going to happen to them. And in Canada, there's no statute of limitation. So if something happens now, the company goes in the foreign market and operates unethically, they obtain a contract by bribery, and 5 years, 10 years down the road, they accumulate a whole bunch of profit. Well, we can go back because all this profit that's obtained is proceeds of crime. So that's where the disgorgement come in. So they lose all the profit plus the fine that comes out of it. So the evolution of enforcement is continuously changing. But what is also changing is the focus, where there's greater demand for action on corruption, whether domestically or internationally. So, and it's becoming harder because of social media for companies to hide their unlawful behavior, and also for a foreign public official.
Wow, that was a lot.
He's not a man of few
Where to
words.
start?
I don't talk a lot.
Let me if I can add a bit of dose of reality on the enforcement side. And first to distinguish between domestic corruption, which is covered, as Pat said, under our criminal code. So that's the corruption of Canadian public officials, MPs, judicial officers, administrative folks in the government, versus foreign corruption. And I think most here, and I think you'd agree, Pat, as well, that for a very long time we had a situation where companies felt that it was completely fine to do things in foreign countries that you would never do in Canada. And there was kind of a double standard to that. And the intention was that that would change once we brought the CFPOA into force, the Corruption of Foreign Public Officials Act, which prohibits foreign bribery. That came into force in 1999 in accordance with our obligations under the OECD Convention. And then we also made some changes in order to comply with the UN Convention Against Corruption, which would have been around 2007, 2008. During that time, there was no aggressive enforcement. In fact, there was only one case, 2005, HydroClean, where the company was penalized $25,000 for making a $35,000 bribe. So the amount of the penalty was less than the amount of the bribe in that case. And in fact, I think the case was a bit of an embarrassment for Canada. Since then, there's only been 3 convictions under the CFPOA. And those convictions occurred between 2011 and 2014. 2 of them were guilty pleas by companies, so Nyco Resources and Griffiths Energy each ended up pleading guilty and paying a fine of around, for Griffiths it was $10.35 million, for Nyco it was $9.5 million. So we're talking about a fine in the $10 million range. The 3rd conviction was an individual, Nazir Karagar. He was convicted in August of 2014, and his appeal to the Ontario Court of Appeal was just dismissed earlier this year over the summer. But since 2014, although there's been some investigative action in Canada, there's been no more convictions. And I think this is an important point for you folks here. Some of you are consulting and working with companies. Some of you are working in companies where you need to demonstrate to management that this stuff matters. And there might be a bit of a deficit in that there are executives looking at the record here in Canada and seeing that there hasn't been much activity when it comes to actual convictions. And in fact, Pat, you spoke about the focus on individuals, and Nazir Karagar, I think, is a good example of getting a conviction on an individual, getting a sentence of 3 years at a time when the maximum was 5 years, which I think was a good sign as well. But on the other hand, looking at the SNC-Lavalin situation, you had 7 individuals that were charged in connection with those activities, some agents or ex-employees of SNC. 5 of those have been dropped or dismissed. There are 2 left that are going through the process, but someone looking at that record might suggest that Canada isn't as aggressive as some would think. And I think that is a bit of an issue, but I think it's important for you to realize as well that there are things going on around the world here, in the UK and France, Australia, United States, where there is more aggressive movement and signs of dealing with corruption, which may be part of the greater attention you should be giving to these issues. And I think the other area that is really pushing companies is we're seeing this kind of, I guess what I term a private enforcement of anti-corruption law in commercial transactions. So regardless of what the record might be for convictions, the fact is, and I mentioned this yesterday for those of you at my session on due diligence and private equity and mergers and acquisitions, the fact is when you are engaged in these transactions, and if your client is a small company that's looking to be acquired, if they are small companies that's looking to do an IPO, go public, get bank financing, get private equity investment, those investors, underwriters, acquirers, financiers, they are all very keyed in to the corruption issue. And they understand that this goes to the inherent value of your organization. Regardless of what the record might be in Canada for convictions, they understand that a company that doesn't have a compliance program in place or has only a paper compliance program, we'll talk about that later, is a huge risk for them, aside from any conviction risk. The fact is, people will not want to touch them with a 10-foot pole if they have any concerns about that, specifically even for private equity. When they're looking at building a portfolio of companies, developing those companies, and then selling them, the last thing they need is a corruption issue in one of those companies, which could completely destroy the value of the company. So I think when we look at the developments on the enforcement side and how that should impact your compliance program and what you should be doing from a compliance point of view, I think that might be too narrow a focus. I think you need to understand what's really going on in the broad sense out there in terms of the commercial transactions that are occurring in this kind of private enforcement of anti-corruption that we see in those commercial transactions in the due diligence.
Yeah, I totally agree, because the reality is that we suffer from a visibility deficit in terms of enforcement. We don't have a lot of cases. It's the reality. And it's not that our officers are not working hard, it's just the nature of the beast in terms of the length and the complexity of these type of investigation. And hopefully, with what's happening with the Government of Canada review, we might have some deferred prosecution agreement coming in the next couple of years that might change, and hopefully change, the dynamic of things in terms of enforcement action. But
and
I agree.
I was just going to say, just so everyone understands that concept of a deferred prosecution agreement, that explains a lot of the enforcement activity you see in the United States. And I'm not suggesting the RCMP or Crown prosecutors aren't doing their job in Canada. That's not the case at all. I think they are, but they're operating within a very different regime than the United States. I mean, first and foremost, we don't have a name and shame system up here in Canada like there is in the United States. And frankly, lots of examples of press releases and so forth in the United States that highlight the issue. And we don't have that same kind of practice or history here in Canada. But when Pat refers to DPAs and the ongoing consultation that's occurring now, and I think submissions you mentioned were due by November 17, Canada is considering adopting a regime like that. And the significance of that is, under the DPA regime, a company can go into negotiations with the prosecutor and enforcement authorities, negotiate a fine, possibly negotiate monitoring or remedial measures that are going to be monitored for up to a 3-year period afterwards, but not get a conviction of the company. So that's possible under a deferred prosecution agreement. Right now in Canada, if the government's going to get its pound of flesh, if they're going to get a penalty from the company has to be convicted. And so that was the case with HydroClean that I mentioned earlier. It was the case with NICO. It was the case with Griffiths Energy. They all had to be convicted in order to extract that penalty. And conviction carries with it impacts that go well beyond the payment of a penalty for a company. It violates their financial covenants that they might have with their banks. They can be debarred if they're convicted. It can have, it can result in the layoff of employees. It has impacts that go well beyond just the payment of the penalty. So the whole idea behind the deferred prosecution agreement is to get change in the company, to have the company pay some amount, a penalty, but not to be convicted and experience the overwhelming effects of a conviction for a corporate.
Yeah, and that impacts in terms of voluntary disclosure. There's no incentive for a company, if they're looking at criminal prosecution, criminal conviction, and debarment, to collaborate and voluntarily disclose to the RCMP or other authorities. Now, under a DPA, there's an incentive for collaboration. Actually, it's part of the conditions in many of the DPAs is to collaborate. So That, I think, is a game changer for us, but also it will incentivize companies to implement compliance programs, to implement ethical programs, so that they can demonstrate that they're doing their utmost to mitigate their risk. You know, it's all about business risk management when you talk about corruption. And unfortunately, within the criminal prosecutorial process that we have, is what are the risks of me getting caught when there's only, you know, 3 or 4 cases in Canada, as opposed to going to collaborate and, you know, going through the risk. So it's not that we're not doing anything here, it's just that our system is just hampering us from having the numbers that would impact in terms of perception and the risk with companies.
I like that phrase you used, visibility deficit, because that really is what we have here. So if you do look at what's going on in the United States and those examples, those very public examples of deferred prosecution agreements and the list of things that the company has to do over the next 3 years, that provides all kinds of guidance. Not just to American companies, frankly, to Canadian companies. And even in the NICO case, when they were coming up with a monitoring program, they looked at one of those DPAs in the United States and almost tracked it word for word in terms of what NICO was expected to do over its 3-year monitoring or probation period. So that does, I think, largely explain the difference between Canada and the United States, and why we have this kind of visibility deficit here in Canada, and I think that's important to understand that once we do have a mechanism like a DPA in place, we should see a lot of change in that area. Because frankly, right now, the incentive for companies who might discover a problem, and we'll talk about the things companies should do when they do discover a problem. Let's say, you know, they get a whistleblower report, or they discover that one of their officials, one of the company officers had offered a bribe to a public official. The incentive to come forward is not significant. And subject to securities and public disclosure law, it can be completely acceptable from a legal point of view, and I'd say even from an ethical point of view, for a company to fix that problem and move forward without doing a voluntary disclosure to the RCMP. And I know the RCMP folks don't like to hear that, but there are circumstances, like, you don't have to disclose everything. You don't always have to open the kimono to the authorities when things like this happen. There is also a path to fixing it and moving forward. And if, you know, in the future you face questions from the RCMP or others, you address the questions, but you fix the problem. That's the key thing there. You fix the problem.
Yes, I mean, yes, as a former police officer, it's nice to have people come in and talk, but there's no legal obligation for anybody to disclose. Mm-hmm. And that's one reason that I was always speaking the gospel of compliance, because as my role of outreach, I needed to, when I talk to businesses, it's not just, I want to arrest you, you're going to go to jail. Because the record shows that, well, we only have 3 cases, really, that we can show. But it's having a business case. Why is it important for you to know this? Why is it important for your business to know the risk? And the risk is not just illegal criminal prosecution. It's all the secondary costs that are associated to being caught up in the cycle of corruption. You know, from financing to shareholders to liability to huge costs that are associated to this that really impacts the business on top of the criminal prosecution. So by building the business case you need to have compliance, you need to do something. It's about changing behavior. You know, 35 years in police, I did drugs, organized crime. We're not dealing with the Hells Angels here, although some CEOs act like organized crime officials. But anyway, what's important to look at is their business people, and yeah, they might be focused just on the next quarter and the bonus, but is to bring them back to the reality that they're exposing themselves and the company to huge costs and huge liability, civil and criminal. And to make a business case that you need to know how to protect yourself. When you go to this jurisdiction, you don't do your due diligence. You don't check your agent. And it's in certain jurisdiction, it's not If you're going to be asked for a bribe, it's when. That's the reality. And if you don't prepare yourself for that, you're going to get in trouble. So for me, from a prosecution or from an investigative perspective, because it's complex investigation, it was worth my time to work with industry to prevent it in the first place. So this is what, you know, the last 2 days was about too. It's about compliance. It's about making the case for businesses that you need to really protect yourself. And ultimately, it's a business decision. It's not a cost. It shouldn't be a cost line. It's an investment that companies make.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Patrice and John. At this point, do you have any question from the audience that would like to jump in? Sure. He's just going to walk towards you with the microphone. So.
What's that?
Hi.
Hello.
I'm Michael Redmond. I have a few questions. I've done consulting for lots of clients and do the due diligence, especially with a third party. My question is, and looking at the Canada also within their process, especially for small companies, you know, they really don't have the budget to do the level of due diligence that perhaps they should on some of the clients, and they'll say, this is the level I want to go to. And maybe over a 6-month period, things start to show up. And someone had mentioned yesterday that whenever you're doing a contract with a third party, you should have a clause in there that gives you an out. If you, I believe you, maybe you said it, if there's a, give you an out. I did listen. Gives you an out if you know, you find something later on. So my question is, 3 of them actually together, but it's all one question. The first part is, if you do find something during that time period and you find that you need an out, how do you justify that you actually did your due diligence and this was something that just now showed up? 2, if you do want an out in the closets in there and such, and you've already have a lot of funds invested within this project or the program you're putting in place, what are ways to actually clean it up and actually get credit for it from a not a quantitative risk point, but from a qualitative, going out and saying, hey, you know, we did this on our own, we found this out, you know, we really care about our clients and our products and services. So is that a possibility to put a positive spin on that? And if so, has it been done? And the third question I have is, for large firms who are doing this, that do put in the tons of hours and have the forensics accounting and everything else, when do they say, okay, that's enough? We've done enough. We're finished with our due diligence. We feel secure.
No, go ahead, John. Start.
A lot of questions in there. I guess, first of all, there's no one compliance program that's going to fit all situations. And I think we're always saying, and I'm sure a lot of you are saying, that the small company does not have to boil the ocean on these issues. That judgment calls have to be made. That you're dealing with a smaller set of resources in certain organizations. I would never, though, use that to justify cutting corners. And I think as much as we, in the compliance community, try to make those smaller organizations feel a bit better about these issues by saying, well, you don't have to do X and Y, you don't have to do what the big guys are doing with forensic investigation. There are situations where, frankly, if they perceive that risk you described with an agent, and they're thinking we just can't afford to do much more, so let's retain the agent, there are situations where they shouldn't retain that agent. If it's a resource issue and they can't afford to dig, but they still have those suspicions, I think the decision just has to be made. We don't retain the agent, and I know that's not it's not a popular thing to say, but I've seen those situations as well. So I don't think we can give too much comfort that, you know, simply because you can't afford it, it's fine not to do it.
Yeah. Frankly, in certain circumstances, you can't afford not to. Okay? And it's all based on risk. As you mentioned, you can't boil the ocean. And you're not going to go to the enhanced due diligence in every case. But you need to demonstrate, if an investigation comes in, okay, to have credit, as you mentioned, or to seek a declination under our current process, you need to demonstrate very clearly that you've done your utmost. You will never eliminate corruption. It can't be done. Okay, let's start from that base. But if you demonstrate negligence, you didn't do the right amount of diligence according to the risk you had, and you're going to a very high-risk jurisdiction, and the highest risk is actually using a third party, and you just, well, let's just do this, you haven't demonstrated you've done your utmost to prevent it. Okay, so it is a judgment call, yes, but it's based on the risk. And if you can demonstrate clearly that you've done your utmost, they're more likely to go after the individual that provided the bribe as opposed to the company. This is by case. It's not a pat answer. But for me, companies that say, well, we can't afford to do this. No, we can't afford not to in this risk profile. Okay? You can justify, well, we're doing it in Canada, and it's, we're doing a business transaction with a third party. Well, there's a little more accountability in the Canadian environment than somewhere else. So this is where people, at the end, it's a business decision, okay? But you have to live with it. And you have to be able to build a narrative to justify if something happens.
Yeah, and I think, too, one of our big messages today, and you've probably already heard this throughout yesterday, is that risk assessment is a key part to this whole process. It comes up when you're evaluating business partners, targets, third parties. It comes up, though, also when you're creating your compliance program and deciding how far to go in those circumstances. Risk assessment is your friend in this case because it can save you a lot of money if done properly as well. The idea that you're going to focus your resources, you're going to be efficient about the use of your compliance resources, focus them on the areas of high risk for the organization. And I can't tell you, I mentioned this in my session yesterday, I can't tell you how many times we get that phone call from a CFO, sometimes a CEO, or someone in senior management saying, the board wants to see our anti-corruption compliance program. Can you guys send us one off the shelf? We don't do that, and we're very clear to them, the clients or potential clients, that we don't do that for their protection, for our protection as well. There's just too many instances now of these paper policies out there, the RCMP finding them when they're investigating, and there being no evidence of implementation within the organization, no documented evidence of these programs. So you can't take this kind of buckshot approach to the market and say, we'll just put in this general policy and hope for the best. There are thousands of these policies on the internet. Companies publish their policies. And if you're going to take that approach, don't bother calling an expert, just download something off the internet. But you're equally at risk when you do something like that.
Part of my role when I was in the RCMP was actually to evaluate the strength and the scope of compliance program for companies that we investigated. That was my role. And I tell you, sometimes, in one instances, we found a compliance program that was obviously downloaded from the internet because we investigated company XYZ, and they forgot to change the name in the compliance program in certain pages, and it was still ABC. Pretty obvious. So that doesn't really hold water and doesn't help the company. And you have to look when the risk management is, okay, it's going to cost us so much. Yeah, it's a lot of money. But think of the cost if you don't. Because it's going to be multiplier in terms of the cost if something happens. Of course, it's all risk-based. You can't do it all with every single transaction. But when you do it properly, you'll feel much more satisfied because then you can protect yourself. Not just from legal liability, but you're more likely to find the smoking gun or find a red flag when you do your due diligence. Any other questions?
Other questions? Okay, so in that same line.
Oh, you get another one in the back there.
Sorry.
Hi, my name is Jean-Charles Périgny. I work for Hydro Quebec. If you don't mind, I'm going to speak in French because we are in Montreal. Okay.
Parfait.
Quand on regarde sur un horizon de 5 ans le progrès au Québec, je regarde que dans le fond, il y a eu il y a eu la commission Charbonneau, on a eu la création de l'UPAC, on a eu aussi le RENA qui a été mis en place. Et quand on parle d'un déficit de visibilité au niveau là, de cas de collusion, corruption, Bien, au Québec, quand je regarde le RENA, nous sommes rendus à plus ou moins de 600 entreprises sur le RENA pour des actes, certains qui sont des actes criminels. Je regarde aussi au niveau de la commission Charbonneau, on voit beaucoup de cas de cas médiatiques. Il y a des grands changements qui se sont introduits. Donc, quand vous parlez de déficit de visibilité, j'ai comme l'impression qu'on parle beaucoup du Canada, mais l'arrimage avec le Québec et tout ce qui se fait, j'aimerais ça vous entendre là-dessus. Puis je sais aussi qu'on s'en va vers des accords commerciaux avec l'Ontario, l'Europe. Donc là, ça nous amène à nous questionner aussi sur tout le système de perte de privilèges de soumissionner. Donc, je sais que, dans le fond, le régime au gouvernement fédéral a son propre régime. Des fois, comment la Banque mondiale aussi, certaines organisations en Europe aussi. Donc, comment faire pour une entreprise, lorsqu'on regarde la multiplication, quels sont ses meilleurs mécanismes de défense? Ça, c'est des genres de questions que j'aimerais vous entendre là-dessus. Puis aussi, je dirais, s'il y a 3 choses qu'une entreprise ou une corporation publique devait mettre en place, quels seraient les 3 premiers éléments?
Il y a beaucoup de questions, là. Je ne sais pas si on va me souvenir de toutes les choses. Je sais pas. Écoutez, il y a une réalité que, oui, je suis jaloux de l'UPAC et tous les cas qui ont passé. Tu vois, au niveau de quand je regarde la GRC, avant la commission Charbonneau, le Québec, vous vous souvenez dans McLean, Québec, c'est la province la plus corrompue. Non, disons-nous que c'est partout au Canada. Okay? La corruption, le même niveau de corruption, on peut le trouver dans d'autres provinces. Maintenant, le Québec est à la fine pointe au niveau des mesures anticorruption. Il faut le reconnaître. Et puis, ça commence à se faire reconnaître dans d'autres provinces. Est-ce qu'au niveau médiatique, au niveau national, c'est aussi reconnu? Non, il y a un manque sur ce côté-là. Mais il y a d'autres provinces qui regardent le Québec et disent « Hey, on aimerait ça peut-être apprendre des leçons et puis faire la duplication de certains de leurs efforts. Okay, » Au niveau, même le Toronto regarde pour un inspecteur général et d'autres choses comme ça. Mais c'est évolutif. Okay? On n'a pas les meilleurs, on n'a pas toutes les réponses, on n'a pas toutes les meilleures solutions. Mais je pense qu'il y a des choses à apprendre, il y a des leçons à apprendre par rapport aux autres provinces, par rapport au fédéral aussi, de regarder qu'est-ce qui se passe au Québec. Puis on le fait, ça, je peux vous le dire. C'est ça, il y a dans le cadre de concertation, de discussion, on le regarde. Mais si on regarde aussi dans le fait du programme d'intégrité du gouvernement du Canada, on apprend aussi certaines leçons du Québec pour changer puis améliorer au niveau de la procuration. J'ai travaillé dans le cadre de concertation avec Travaux publics Canada, où est-ce qu'on a fait venir les gens du Québec pour dire « Qu'est-ce que vous faites maintenant? » Alors, c'est en train de se faire. Je ne sais pas au niveau des trois meilleures pratiques, là, on va peut-être pouvoir revenir sur ça, mais ce que je peux vous dire, c'est que oui, il n'y a peut-être pas assez de promotion de ce qui se passe au Québec, dans le reste du Canada, mais je peux vous le dire qu'en arrière-plan, ça se fait. Peut-être pas au niveau médiatique, mais ça se fait. Je ne sais pas si ça répond à toutes les... Je ne réponds pas à toutes les questions, là.
On se retrouve avec des choses un peu particulières quand même. C'est que là, des fois, le fédéral va enlever le privilège de soumissionner à certaines entreprises, puis le Québec ne le fait pas, ou vice-versa. Donc là, comme entreprise, on se dit, ben là, qu'est-ce qu'on fait, là?
C'est peut-être, c'est hors de mes ressources. Je pense que c'est plus au niveau gouvernemental où est-ce qu'il y a besoin d'avoir des discussions pour avoir peut-être une plateforme où est-ce que s'il y a un recouvrement, s'il y a des mesures qui sont prises au niveau de la procuration, de barrer une compagnie, que ça soit confirmé à plusieurs niveaux. Parce que si vous le savez, avec les banques de développement, si le World Bank fait un debarment, mais toutes les autres banques de développement font la même chose. Alors, c'est la consultation pour avoir quelque chose qui est plus conforme, pour avoir, en anglais, predictability, pour que les entreprises puissent savoir comment s'en tirer avec le fédéral ou le provincial. On n'a pas toutes les réponses, là, mais je pense qu'il y a un mouvement, au moins au niveau de discussion, pour améliorer le processus, si vous voulez.
Si je peux me permettre, je pense aussi qu'au Québec, ce qui est important, c'est qu'il faut qu'il y ait concertation entre les donneurs d'ouvrage. Je pense que c'est souvent le donneur d'ouvrage, si tout le monde s'entend dire, bien, on va utiliser la même ligne de conduite, autant fédérale que provinciale, ça, je pense que ça va aider. Je sais que suite à la commission Charbonneau, il y avait eu le livre blanc dans l'industrie de la construction. Ce qui a résulté de ça, c'est une initiative qui a été de créer ce qu'on appelle le Bureau de certification intégrité, où c'est les entreprises qui vont adhérer à des règles d'intégrité. Et ça, je pense que des règles d'intégrité, c'est important. Souvent, il y a des gens qui ne voient pas la différence entre la conformité puis l'éthique. Je pense que tu peux être conforme, mais sans nécessairement respecter l'éthique. On a juste à penser un peu au niveau de la fiscalité. Tu peux faire de l'évasion fiscale, tu peux faire de l'évitement fiscal. Et on s'entend que si tu ne respectes pas, tu peux respecter la loi, mais peut-être pas nécessairement respecter l'esprit de la loi. Et souvent, on dit que la conformité, c'est un plancher au niveau de l'éthique, ce n'est pas le plafond. Et je pense que dans les règles, comme vous êtes tantôt de mettre en place, souvent, moi, je dis aux gens, c'est la règle des médias. Si un journaliste t'appelle et te pose une question sur un de tes sous-traitants, sur une des transactions que tu as fait, comment tu vas te sentir? Tu vas te sentir très confortable d'expliquer, tu as un dossier qui supporte tout ce que tu vas avancer, ou tu te sens un peu nerveux? Et ça, je pense que souvent, c'est dans les règles à suivre, c'est de dire, est-ce qu'on a assez documenté, est-ce qu'on se sent confortable? Et souvent, je pense que la conformité, l'éthique, et qu'on l'appelle comme qu'on voudra, c'est un niveau de confort qu'on a, un niveau de confort en se disant, on est conscient qu'en ce moment, peut-être que oui, effectivement, les gens n'appliquent pas les règles de la même façon, sauf que, advenant qu'il y aurait une concertation, comment on pourrait s'en sortir? Et ça, je pense que c'est important. D'autres questions? I know that maybe for some of you, that was pretty French. I don't know if you would like us to translate in English everything that was said, or if you were okay with the conversation we had. Maybe Patrice, just a quick overview of what you...
Not everything, but I think the salient point here is that a compliance program is a very, very strong tool. It's a necessary tool. Companies need to take the time to implement properly, but having a compliance program doesn't mean you're ethical, because how it's implemented, how you apply it, you know, you've got this nice little piece of paper and all the employees sign off on it, but if it's the core of the culture of the company is not ethical, then that document, that compliance program is not worth anything, because it doesn't really impact on the behavior of the main players. So it's important to look at the totality of things where, you know, in Quebec, with the Charbonneau Commission, you know, Quebec was put in an enviable position to be, oh, look, Quebec is the most corrupt province in Canada, which is not. You have corruption all over Canada. It's not just in Quebec. Okay? Let's be clear. Every province, every municipality, there is a problem that exists. But what has evolved from the Charbonneau Commission is that Quebec now is at the forefront in terms of anti-corruption measures. There's nothing perfect. There's no system that's perfect. But at least there's a movement towards improving the system. And the other provinces are looking at Quebec, and even federal government looking at lessons learned to try to implement and apply them in the best way possible. Mm-hmm. So this is evolutionary process, okay? And if we can at least celebrate the fact that it did happen, okay, it allows us now to put a clear light on what happened so that we can move forward and need to know what we can do to try to prevent it from happening, not just in Quebec, but in the rest of Canada.
Yeah, let me add to that. I was kind of getting the gist of what was being said in French, but it was a little too dangerous for me to say anything, and I apologize, I can't speak in French. I actually think there is corruption going on at the provincial and municipal levels elsewhere in Canada outside of Quebec. It's happened now to come forward in Quebec, and it's a painful, difficult process to go through. But I can't reiterate more that Quebec has now implemented measures that I think would make it safer to do business in this province than other provinces, frankly, because it has come out in the light. This has been exposed to sunshine. It's being disinfected. And in fact, it's quite similar, I think, to what's happening in Brazil. And I'm not saying Quebec is the same as Brazil, but people are, you know, wringing their hands about what's going on in Brazil. But it's all coming to light. In fact, they're putting people in jail in Brazil. Government officials are going to jail. Company officials are going to jail because they violated anti-corruption norms in Brazil. People seem to forget about that, and they're just fixated with all kinds of headlines about how there's all this corruption in Brazil. But I actually think Brazil is going to be stronger for it, and stronger than many of its Latin American or developing country counterparts.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds good. So on that same kind of way of thinking, as of October 31st of this year, facilitation payment became illegal. So how significant is that for a Canadian company that are operating abroad in a high-risk jurisdiction?
Go ahead.
Do you want me to start?
Yes, start.
Okay. We may have some different views on this. Just so everyone understands what a facilitation payment is, typically a small payment, typically made to a low-level public official in order to have him or her provide some non-discretionary service. And what we mean by non-discretionary service or action is something that's already due to you under the law. So under the CFPOA, we had an exception for facilitation payments. They are a form of bribery, kind of a small bribe, but there was an exception for these payments because in certain countries this activity is so widespread that it's difficult to otherwise operate in those countries. The United States has a similar exception in its Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Not many other countries have these exceptions in their foreign corruption legislation. The UK most notably does not. I think you could argue that the norms have been changing in this area, pushing towards not having an exception for these facilitation payments. And we can talk about some of the challenges with it, but just so you have a background on this, in 2013, in June of 2013, Canada amended the CFPOA to provide that this exception could be removed by an order in council. They didn't remove it. They simply signaled that it could be removed, much like a regulation would be made, without having to go through Parliament and have the legislation amended. And the thought at the time was it would be a year or so that they would give companies time to adjust their practices so that they no longer would make these small payments for getting their goods across the border, getting through a customs checkpoint, getting their telephone or cable service hooked up. And companies, it was thought, were to phase those payments out. Now, it didn't happen in a year, it didn't happen in 2 years. It actually took over 4 years for them to put it in place. So it actually came quite suddenly in an announcement on October 30th that effective tomorrow, October 31st, these are outlawed. And I think you could argue some companies should have known it was coming, but frankly, when you had silence on it for about 4 years, it caught a lot of companies off guard. And now I think companies need to think about, particularly if you're operating in those jurisdictions where you're making these small facilitation payments, you need to think about how you're going to handle that situation now.
It will be challenging for a lot of companies. Facilitation payments, though, are a bribe. Let's be clear. Let's also be clear, is a company likely to be investigated by the RCMP for a $50 bribe to a Border Patrol officer? Not likely just on that one action alone. But what it does, and I think one of the reasons why it was implemented is the fact that if you want to change a culture within a corporation in terms of not allowing corruption and bribery to thrive, is that you can't on one side say, well, small bribery is okay, big bribery is bad. There's a dichotomy there, and you need to put this in context. But having said that, is how do you train your people? How do you protect your people? And what strategies can be applied for various corporations to deal with the fact that when you go to the border or when you go get licensing, you're likely to be asked for a bribe. And this is where I agree with John that it could have been, it says, okay, in 6 months we're going to be applying it here. But it's part of the process of mitigating risk. Because a lot of companies, even in Canada, even though it was not implemented, disallowed facilitation payment. It was illegal in their policy because they didn't want to have that conflict and that dichotomy within their policy. But what's easier for large corporations is that they have the heft, they have the size to go in to the minister and say, I'm going to put you on speed dial to all my employees, so if they're approached, they're going to call you, okay, in terms of strategy. But having said that, small and medium-sized companies can also build strategies to help them mitigate that risk. Either they go collectively, they train their people, and there's ways to mitigate it. And I think it's important for the small and medium-sized enterprise to start now, if they haven't started already, to think ahead. How do you train your employee when they're going to be facing this? Because they will be facing it, so that they don't put you at risk, and that you don't conflict your message as, you know, we're an ethical company, we're never paying bribes, but that bribe is okay. So it is not an easy process, but it needs to be, that discussion needs to be had, and it needs to be clear that you're going to move towards that. Because if you allow this to happen and there's a pattern that continues, then it's easier internally, and I think you guys are going to be talking about in the second session, to validate the fact, well, I'm paying a small bribe and I want to get my bonus later, and it's acceptable now, so let's do this. See, so it opens up the door for higher bribes. And for me, ethically, legally, it shouldn't happen. Let's not be naive that it doesn't happen, but corporations need to prepare themselves what strategy they need to implement to help their employees that will face these type of pressures, mitigate it and prevent it.
Yeah, I would add to, this is going to be a very big challenge for some companies. I know there's some that can't go through a day in certain jurisdictions without making facilitation payments. And there are some that are going to have to make a decision as to whether they continue to operate in those jurisdictions. And that can't be the result of banning facilitation payments. And what I mean by that is, I mean, if that's, we're going to have to figure something else out, because if the impact of this is that companies are going to withdraw from jurisdictions that have a lot of high frequency of these facilitation payments, then this is just completely counterproductive. And so I do hope that, I mean, one thing Pat raised was, you know, possibly prosecutorial discretion here when, you know, we're saying how likely is it that the RCMP is going to go after a $50 payment, and I do see that being unlikely. However, from a company's point of view, they would never want to condone, either in practice or in writing, something that is clearly illegal under the CFPOA. So they still struggle with it, regardless of what the prosecutorial discretion might be. They still struggle with it because they have to address it in their compliance programs. They can't just simply ignore it. The other thing to keep in mind, in addition to some of the strategies Pat mentioned, and frankly, I think there's going to be some companies that just can't implement some of those strategies, either because of their size or otherwise, given the nature of the jurisdiction. But it is important to keep in mind that promotional, hospitality, entertainment expenses that are reasonable are still permitted under the legislation. There are exceptions for payments that are made in accordance with local laws. That's still permitted. So in a few jurisdictions, for example, to have a government official come and examine your mine or your factory, you pay them a stipend or travel expenses or a meal or something for the day. That typically is set out in the local legislation. So if you're paying in accordance with local legislation, even though some people might call that a facilitation payment, that actually would be exempt under another provision under the CFPOA. And of course, exceptions for situations of duress still exist as well. So if at any time your employee who's at a border checkpoint feels that his life, safety, liberty are in question, he or she should be free to make that payment if that's an issue. And that's really the exception of duress, which is you know, a broad one under criminal law. It's just not restricted to foreign corruption.
Any question from the audience? Any specific question on that issue? Okay, I have a next one, and that's will be probably about the last one. We hear very often about what they call compliance 2.0. And I would like to know, from your point of view, what have changed in terms of expectation from regulators and enforcers in relation to a compliance program?
Why don't you start with it? Yeah.
Let's see, the first version of compliance several years ago was really about the substance of a paper exercise. So having a document that outlines what the controls, what the policies were, and what the function of compliance was. But what was identified in terms of gaps was the lack of expertise, a lack of competency in the compliance function, where it was given to somebody sometimes that just didn't have the experience, the knowledge, the competency to implement all these new policies, and how the policies themselves or the compliance program was not properly implemented. So it was a paper exercise where it was not implemented, where there was really no controls, where the training was lacking, where there was no real strategies to deal with the issues. So companies could say, I've got a compliance program, look, you know, the paper exercise. But it didn't protect them because bribery and corruption happened wantonly because people didn't believe in it. There was no consequence. There was no whistleblowing program. So that also led to, at the time in certain jurisdictions, specifically in the United States, where, okay, you have a compliance program, you get credit for it, but it was not looked into. It wasn't evaluated. It wasn't validated. That changed in the last 5 years, where the compliance function became a professional function, where the competency of that compliance function was critical. The independence of that compliance function was critical, where the resources, money, and the reporting structure, where it was reporting to the board instead of the people that might be involved in corruption, changed. And also, in terms of the program itself, more substance, okay? More focus on how it's implemented. We're more focused on the whistleblowing program so that it was substantive. So from 1.0 to 2.0, huge change, but also it provided more credit and more ability for the company to now protect themselves and the offending parties to be focused on the ones that provide it. So what it does, in essence, a compliance 2.0, when it's applied properly, it provides that protection for that company, where it's more likely that the prosecution or regulators will go after the offending parties, those that provide the bribe, as opposed to the company itself, because they'll be able to demonstrate very clearly that they've done their utmost to implement, to protect. And the compliance function now, there's liability comes in as well, because if the compliance officer does not do his or her job, there's liability issues now. So the professionalization is good, but also the liability has increased in terms of where they're situated and where the market internally or even regulators might go after that individuals. There's cases of compliance officers now being sued or being charged for not doing their job. So there's an evolution to this, which is good for the company, good for anybody here that's working in compliance, because we need to professionalize that function. We need to elevate it to the point where it's not just an expense line, but it is an insurance policy for the company in terms of how they operate.
I think Pat's covered it well, and I want to leave some room for questions, but I just want to make one comment on another big sea change. I think within the last 5 years or so, there's maybe 5 to 10 years, there's been a real change in attitude and awareness within companies about where their technology ends up, who uses their services and technology, who's getting their product, is their product ending up in a sanctioned country, and most importantly, who do they deal with as counterparties, who stands behind those companies, who are the beneficial owners of those companies. We've seen with disclosures like Panama Papers and so forth that regardless of what your legal obligation might have been, the reputational exposure is now overwhelming on these issues. And so when I look at this from a broad point of view, so from the anti-corruption point of view, when you're looking at your counterparties or the agents you're retaining, from a sanctions point of view, when you're looking at the companies you're doing business with and ensuring it's simply not a numbered company, the same from export controls, AML, anti-terrorism laws, there is more onus, expectation, I think is a good word. There's more expectation on companies to know who they're dealing with, who's standing behind these companies that they're dealing with, and being able to demonstrate from a due diligence point of view that they've done all they can to make sure that they've tracked up the ownership chain, they know who the beneficial owners are. Now, there will be situations where that stuff is hidden in such a way that you'll never discover it in the normal course, and that's fine. You want to be able, though, when stories break, when crises arise, that you find out you're dealing with a company that's got beneficial ownership, based on someone who's blacklisted in Iran or a terrorist. You want to be able to demonstrate that you did all that was reasonably expected in terms of diligencing who the beneficial owner was in those circumstances. So I think that's a big sea change over the last few years that I've seen across all these kind of areas of compliance.
Yeah, and I think a really important point to underline here is that with this evolution of compliance is in the current context of the global business environment, having a strong compliance program is now becoming a competitive business advantage. It actually helps businesses get more business. Because whether it's a VC venture capitalist, whether it's joint venture, M&As, insurance, banking, whatever, it actually helps the company secure financing or the business, because now they can reasonably assure their partners or the funders that they've done their utmost in terms of due diligence to protect the investment, to protect the company, and protect whatever investment or insurance or whatever transaction is coming through the collaboration. So we didn't have that 5-10 years ago. Now it's becoming. So whether you're certified 37001 or whether you have something that you can demonstrate, now having a compliance program is providing more business. And I've got plenty of examples, and I'm sure John has as well, of companies that told us point blank, if I didn't have this, I wouldn't have had the funding from VCs. Because these venture capitalists with these companies that I've talked to says, the first or second question I was asked, let me see your compliance program. So why would I invest in you if you're going to put my money at risk? Because you're operating in Ghana, in these jurisdictions, show me what you have. So that has shifted now the business culture, and it's a good thing. Okay, so we need to promote it even more.
Thank you very much. Guys, people, any questions? Well, that kind of wrap up our first roundtable. Well, I want to personally thank Patrice and John for the great job they did. I think they were straight shooters. They told you exactly what it was. Sometimes there was things that are considered still to be taboo.
We actually agreed.
And we do actually don't have to stick and say, well, we're not supposed to talk about that. No, we have to be open about it and realize that if we don't talk about it, well, nothing ever going to change. So thank you very much, Patrice and John. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.